But do you want to know the really terrifying thing? JK's book, The Silkworm, was published under her alias, Robert Galbraith, as in Robert Galbraith Heath, the world-famous psychologist who tortured a gay convict to prove it possible to turn them straight. And I know what you're thinking. No wonder Graham loves her. Because if there's one thing Graham loves, it's psychologists that torture queer people, especially those unable to give informed consent due to being underage or under legal duress. But being serious for a moment, Robert Galbraith is such a niche name, and there's no way in hell Rowling or her publisher didn't check to see who shared the name before selecting it. So the only reasonable conclusion is that she picked this name knowing its history. She either didn't care that it was a name associated with the horrific practice of torturing queer people, or she chose it specifically because of that association. And yet she pretends like she gives a rat's ass about gay people. It's the same hollow declaration as Baroness Queerphobe seen earlier. Now before I begin, I just want to note the fact that in spite of what the news might want you to believe, the massive global protests over police brutality continue and in some places even seem to be gaining more traction. So whilst this video's topic is important, we'd ask that you keep this in mind, follow Black Voices on social media, and consider donating to Black-led, queer-inclusive community projects like the Black Visions Collective. Links to both their website and their donation page can be found at the top of the video description. Anyway, back to the actual video. Let's just start by noting the fact that J.K. Rowling's transphobia has been known about her for years. The trans community tried to tell the rest of you that she was a bigot, and yet have been largely ignored, just like all the other times people call out her bigoted crap. For years she has been uncomfortably close with various transphobic people and organisations, feeding her audience rhetoric that seemed eerily similar to that used by transphobes. Something her PR team would regularly try to pass off as middle-aged moments, as benign slip-ups, no care for how often she appeared to be having them. Yet as early as September of 2018, her transphobia was laid out, conclusively, in a very public fashion. She achieved this by liking an article by professional liar and transphobe Janice Turner. The article and accompanying tweet compared trans women in women's spaces to allowing a fox into a henhouse. The narrative here being that trans women are a predatory danger to cis women. This is in spite of the fact that trans women in the UK have legally been allowed access to women-owned spaces the past decade without incident, a fact that Turner seems set on ignoring. It should also be noted that Janice Turner has the nasty habit of trying to speak as an authority for lesbians, in spite of her being a heterosexual woman, something that seems to be a rather common theme among the anti-trans crowd, and is a point I've covered previously on the channel. Then we had the big event of 2019, how Rowling tweeted her support of Maya Forstater, a woman whose contract with a think tank wasn't renewed following her public displays of transphobia, in which she implied that trans women were a threat to cis women. To be clear, she wasn't fired, the company simply decided her exclusionary rhetoric was too harmful and counterproductive to the think tank's goals. Therefore, her contract would not be renewed once over. So appalling were her words and actions that a judge came out and stated that they were, quote, not worthy of respect in a democratic society, end quote. Yet, Rowling decided to lie about the case, claiming that trans people had got Forstater fired for stating sex is real, and declared to stand with her. Now I know it's never nice to face the I told you so speech, but do you know what's worse? Cis people wasting months or even years denying the bigotry in our faces, only to act shocked when the charade slips too much for even them to deny. Because I'm getting sick of it. Start listening to us when we first raise an issue, and maybe all of us can be spared some pain in the long run. So with that opening sentiment stated, what has happened recently to merit a video? Well, during a promotion for some new book of hers, the Ichabog, Rowling had a competition in which children sent in their drawings of the titular character. some of which she would go on to share on her Twitter, giving them feedback. On one occasion, however, J.K. Rowling posted some, shall we say, revealing information. Seems J.K. had been copy-pasting sentences about an incident that took place in Hyde Park in 2017. Sentences misgendering the trans woman involved. Now the interesting thing is, searching for the quote brings up no article or blog post with the relevant text. This seems to have either been written by Rowling herself, or copied from private materials she has access to. Now I don't want to spend most of this video covering the incident. Again, it took place back in 2017 and was resolved in court in 2018. However, I do want to give a quick breakdown as well as note some of the facts that people like Rowling would rather you didn't know. The incident centers on 3 people: transphobe Maria McLachlan, trans woman Tara Wolfe, and Tara's partner. Now following a transphobic event being cancelled, various attendees, including McLachlan, moved to Hyde Park where a group of human rights protesters, including Tara and her partner, opposed their calls for systemic violence towards trans people. Now during the protest, McLachlan decided it wise to pull out her camera and record said human rights activists whilst approaching them, pausing as Tara broke off from the crowd and attempted to knock the camera out of McLachlan's hand before Tara returned to the crowd. And even though this happened, McLachlan decided to continue to push forward, recording and taunting the crowd until she invaded their personal space and was pushing the camera directly in their faces. Note that the transphobic group in question, which has ties to American fascism, has the habit of uploading photos of human rights activists to encourage cyberstalking and harassment. One of the people there at Hyde Park during the incident, Venice Allen, would go so far as to be removed as a Labour member a couple months later for stalking and harassing a teenage female MP, following her at parties, taking photos of her in the background, and uploading them so she'd receive abuse. Yet this behaviour was known before then, so some of the human rights activists were wearing face covers for precisely this reason, and McLachlan was now close enough to pull those down and record with her camera. So the human rights activists tried to push her back. McLachlan started to fight them, Tara went for the camera again, and things broke down into an all-out scuffle. Now the initial scuffle was very quickly resolved and the sides broke up. However, people soon realized that McLachlan had grabbed a random trans person, dragged them about 20 feet away, and had begun violently shaking them before moving to choke them in a headlock. That person was Tara's partner. Upon realizing this, the human rights activist quickly rushed forward to help them, breaking McLachlan's headlock, knocking her to the floor in the process, at which point the second scuffle broke up. All of this took place in a window of about 40 to 30 seconds. Now the incident went to court. Tara was fined £150 for assault and a further £100 for court expenses. However, and this is an important fact left out of the conversation by most transphobes, the judge refused to award the transphobe compensation on the grounds that she provoked what happened, stating that, quote, compensation would not be appropriate, particularly due to the unhelpful way in which the victim was present at the protest and the way she was filming, end quote. Now we can talk about whether what Tara did was wrong or foolish, but the main takeaway here is that even in a society which is set up to harm trans folk, the judge couldn't rule McLachlan to be without blame. However, due to there being no real examples of trans women being a threat to cis women, the media ran with this story, omitting key details, framing Tara as some violent anti-woman thug, when the truth shows otherwise. This was a messy event 3 years ago. It certainly wasn't Richard Spencer being punched in the face, though there does need to be a conversation about violence in the face of systemic oppression, especially when we consider the fact that not 3 years down the line, we have trans people genuinely preparing to seek asylum in other countries over the UK's transphobia epidemic. Now at the time Rowling was dealing with the fallout over her copy-paste disaster, human rights activist Nicholas Sperling tweeted on the issue, criticizing the author and noting that her constant transphobia made it so she couldn't be trusted around children, something which should not be a controversial statement, especially when we consider the demonstrable risk transphobia poses to queer youth. Attempts to force a trans youth to deny their gender increases attempted suicide from a baseline of 8% to 57%. Hell, simply attempting to convince them to change it increases their attempted suicide from 8% to 23%. The desire to force a trans person to change who they are is an essential trait of transphobia. That is exactly why people like Rowling are so cruel in their actions. It's why they try to legislate us out of public spaces by making it impossible to buy clothes or even go to the toilet. It's to try and force us back into the closet, to hide who we are, to live a lie. And it is dangerous, especially around children who have not yet developed the defenses or the support structure to defend against such unwavering hatred. And the solution is not to demand children have those defenses, since nobody should need them. It's to demand that transphobes cease their transphobia. However, rather than question why she was being judged for her appalling actions that put children at risk, Rowling decided it better to threaten the person who wrote the tweet. Can you imagine that for a second? Being a human rights activist, standing up for the demonstrable safety and well-being of children everywhere, only to have a woman whose worth is measured in millions threaten you for speaking what you can show to be true. Suffice to say, Nicola removed her initial tweet before posting a similar one, laying out her thoughts in a much clearer fashion to protect herself whilst preserving her original message. Following this public display, Rowling would go on to issue an apology to the child in question, but not without pretending like people who disapprove of her violent transphobia, because misgendering is violence, were authoritarian thought police trying to censor her. This coming from one of the most wealthy women on the planet, who had just threatened someone with legal action for describing the harm Rowling's actions can be shown to cause. Since lots of rich people don't seem to know what actual censorship is, allow me to help you with a quick rule of thumb. If people respond negatively to the shit you do whilst you continue to do it for years, that's not censorship, that's criticism. Though things didn't end there. Now that Rowling's transphobic nature was becoming too much for even cis people to ignore, she seems to have decided to go on a bit of a rampage. And next in the crosshairs were trans men and non-binary folk. In response to an article titled Opinion, Creating a More Equal Post-COVID-19 World for People Who Menstruate, Rowling tweeted it, stating that, quote, "People who menstruate? I'm sure there used to be a word for those people. Someone help me out. Wumben? Wimpend? Woomad?" End quote. Now just to be clear, the article itself, authored by 3 women, contains the word women a total of 10 times and the word girls a total of 6 times. Women are not being erased by the article. Trans men and non-binary folk, people who are not and have never been women yet can menstruate, are being included in the title. And that's really it. The article itself makes absolutely no mention of trans men, only mentioning gender non-binary persons once at the starting quote. An estimated 1.8 billion girls, women and gender non-binary persons menstruate, and this has not stopped because of the pandemic. End quote. So the title alone was inclusive of both trans men and non-binary folk, but non-binary folk received only a single mention inside the article, and trans men weren't mentioned at all. And that's too much for Rowling to accept. So much so that Rowling lined up the aforementioned 3 women authors, placing them in the sights of the gender-critical cult. Which, by the way, is a title given by lesbians to the movement Rowling is supporting. A movement which grooms, traps, and abuses said lesbians. These are people Rowling is directing her hateful gender-critical fanbase towards, which is again really funny in a twisted sort of way, considering her previous accusations of authoritarian censorship. Why is it important to include trans men and non-binary folk in menstrual discourse? Well, in publicly acknowledging the facts that some men and some enby folk have periods, it normalizes said qualities in these groups. The long-term effect of which hopefully includes reassuring such people that it's not a defect and they're not alone, reducing gender dysphoria associated with menstruation, as well as feelings of isolation. This in turn can open up better medical access by making them more comfortable in discussing their menstrual health with doctors and therapists, meaning they can get the best care available. Yet it's not just about how we can help their perception, it's also important on account of what we as members of society can do to improve their lives. In educating professionals about the facts that male and enby menstruation is a thing, hopefully they take that knowledge and use it to provide better care. Similarly, it opens discussion about menstrual products in all bathrooms and providing such products to boys and men in poverty as well as women. Last of all, it challenges key transphobic myths. The scientific and medical consensus is clear. Trans people exist and their identities are valid. Men and enby folk menstruate no matter what bigots would like to force you to believe. What many tout as common sense in these sorts of situations is really just maliciously willful ignorance. And this is perhaps why transphobes fight so hard to prevent this being acknowledged, particularly in official circles. It shows their bigotry for what it is, a lie. The point is, by attacking trans-inclusive language aimed at trans men and non-binary folk, Rowling is targeting said people's very existence. She's planting her flag on this hill and telling her millions of followers that trans men and enby folk, well, their menstrual health doesn't matter and their inclusion in public discourse is not welcome. All while she pretends this is about the erasure of women, in spite of the fact that women are mentioned throughout the article. The only way this could be seen as the erasure of women is if Rowling wants to violently misgender trans men and enby folk, which seems to be the case here. Trans men and enby folk are telling Rowling that they are not women, so she needs to sit down and listen. This is not something done to them, it's not even a choice they make, it's an intrinsic part of who they are. Acknowledging that fact is key to their well-being. Though, the irony of this from a woman who chooses to go by male aliases for no other reason than financial gain isn't lost on many people. If Rowling wants to talk about the erasure of women, maybe she should take a look in the mirror. As things continued, Rowling finally decided to put out a thread addressing the issue of her transphobia, stating that, quote, "If sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth. The idea that women like me, who have been empathetic to trans people for decades, feeling kinship because they're vulnerable in the same way as women, i.e. to male violence, hate trans people because they think sex is real and has lived consequences, is a nonsense. I respect every trans person's right to live any way that feels authentic and comfortable to them. I'd march with you if you were discriminated against on the basis of being trans. At the same time, my life has been shaped by being female. I do not believe it's hateful to say so." End quote. Where do I begin with this? Okay, first of all, Rowling dear, shut the fuck up. Your heterosexual ass does not get to talk about same-sex attraction, certainly not in a desperate attempt to weaponize it against trans people. You know fucking better than Graham Linehan when he mocked lesbian Linda Riley, the owner of Diva magazine, Europe's leading magazine for lesbians and bisexual women, implying that said readership weren't real lesbians. Now why did he say that? Well, because Linda Riley used her connections to show that the vast majority of cis lesbians do not feel erased or threatened by trans people. This shit is gross. You are not part of the community. You have no right to talk crap to try and turn segments against one another. Lesbians do not need your bullshit white savior complex, so save it for one of your books. The issue here is not lesbians versus trans people, it's human rights versus transphobia. The few lesbians you have supporting you are just that, a minority of a minority, and they do not wash away your bigotry. And speaking of talking shit, nobody has said sex isn't real. Many trans people hold to a gender-sex distinction. I meanwhile hold gender to be the psychological component of sex in line with the other sexual characteristics, one I believe supersedes all others in regards to evolved social interaction. Yet regardless of which position you look at, neither has stated that sex doesn't exist. This is just another talking point parroted by the gender-critical cult without any merit whatsoever. It is complete nonsense designed to frame the opposition as holding a position they do not, so said fake position can be attacked rather than the arguments actually addressed. Rowling's inventing a problem where there is none, so she can pretend like her position is even slightly justified when it isn't. Moving forward, we have the disgusting phrase that, quote, "I'd march with you if you were being discriminated against on the basis of being trans," end quote. Again, we are living in an age where British trans people are genuinely considering seeking asylum in other countries over how bad things have become, in large part thanks to various people and groups J.K. Rowling has supported. People like Malcolm Clark, co-founder of the misnamed LGBT Alliance, a group primarily comprised of far-right cis-het people that seek to destroy the rights of all LGBT+ folk. Indeed, when discussing LGBT+ inclusive education, Clark attacked it, stating that he did so on grounds of, quote, "predatory gay teachers," end quote, asserting that such LGBT+ inclusive lessons would go on to be, quote, "unnecessary encouragement to predators," end quote. And just to note, Clark's bigoted statements were the very next thing that Rowling posted to her wall. Statements from a man breathing life into lies that gave us Section 28. And it doesn't stop there. Indeed, the LGBT Alliance itself has various associations with American anti-LGBT+ hate groups. Groups such as the Heritage Foundation, the Alliance Defending Freedom, and the Center for Bioethics and Culture Network. All far-right groups that routinely attack the rights of queer folk. Then we have Baroness Nicholson, one of the House of Lords who has been pushing Liz Truss to destroy the already existing equality provisions. She has a colourful history of voting against marriage equality and declaring LGBT+ charity groups paedophiles for having escape buttons. Buttons common among child services designed to protect the individual from domestic abuse. She is also a founder of the NGO Lumos, alongside, you guessed it, J.K. Rowling. And what's more is that while she invokes lesbians to argue against trans people, she has publicly argued this week that marriage equality led to the degrading status of women and girls, declaring that she supports marriage as was proper when Jesus himself apparently founded the United Kingdom. Fun historical fact, same-gender marriage as well as gender nonconformity was legal in the Roman Empire until the 4th century Common Era with the writing of the Theodosian Code during the Christianization of Rome. Point is, these people don't give a fuck about gay people any more than Rowling does. Lesbian, gay and bisexual folk are just a resource to exploit in their eyes, to exploit as a means of hurting trans people. And make no mistake, when they're done with us, they will come for cis, gay and bisexual people. So Rowling has surrounded herself with all these transphobic groups and rhetoric, stuff that has actively done damage to the progress trans people have made over the past few decades, resulting in many to consider abandoning their homes and loved ones just to escape the abuse targeted at us for being trans. And she has the fucking nerve to say, if you were discriminated against. Never have I seen such disgraceful apathy, a lack of care for the harm Rowling has played a part in cultivating these past few years. Again, she's been doing stuff in the background that we don't even know about. But perhaps even worse than that is the way in which she doubles down on this form of gaslighting, telling us that the discrimination we witness daily doesn't exist by love bombing. The assertion that she loves trans people, that she has a kinship with us and has been empathetic towards us for decades, all hollow words completely contradicted by her actions, yet are meant to give the impression that she is not simply your typical hateful bigot. This is a method commonly seen in domestically abusive situations. It is a form of gaslighting, intended on making us question our perception and judgment. Not only will there be trans people so desperate for acceptance that they'll hold on to that lie, but it arms her defenders with the means to derail criticism of her transphobia. In the same way that abusers groom those around them into keeping their victims in check, making sure everyone sees all the times they make a romantic gesture, so surely nobody could doubt their loving nature, Rowling is grooming her spectators. Words are cheap. Love is a mere 4 letters. And yet, in spite of giving nothing, Rowling is trying to gain everything. Any time someone brings up her transphobia, people will reference the time she declared her love for us. It's a tactic the marginalized are all too familiar with. I myself have experienced it surrounding the trans community, both internally and externally, in recent years. And it needs to be called out for what it is. Words with our actions to match are less than worthless. They can actually increase the harm done by ensuring it's never properly dealt with. The solid fact is, you cannot claim to love someone whilst actively undermining their personhood and their rights. You cannot. And any claims otherwise are a disgrace to the very notion of love. And yet, in spite of all of this, children are still being exposed to her intolerance. Why? Well, because the competition is still open. That's right, young people, including young trans people, are being steered towards the Twitter feed of a vocal bigot. They're seeing her messages of hate, normalizing it for them, and that is a problem with the potential to cause long-term harm. Not to forget, this also comes at one of the worst possible times imaginable. We have an ongoing pandemic that is making trans people feel more isolated than ever. The way many of us are staying connected is via social media, which has just been flooded with Rowling's transphobia. And to add salt to injury, all this has happened during the first week of Pride Month, a month where we're supposed to come together and celebrate the progress we as a community have made. There's also the fact that Rowling's actions have given the media a way to distract from the still ongoing Black Lives Matter protests, because whilst large progressive names were concentrating on amplifying the voices of those who have suffered violence at the hands of the system, Rowling decided that this would be a good time to target another marginalized group which faces similar forms of discrimination. People had enough shit to deal with without Rowling forcing herself to the front of public conversation. And to add to that, since I know people are going to ask me about it, the lying piece of crap released a 3,600 word transphobic manifesto just as I was finishing up this video. And I don't have time to respond to that here, meaning that there will likely have to be another video since the lies she spouts are fucking dangerous and need addressing, tying even more time into dealing with her bigotry. Thing is, none of this is new. Indeed, her transphobia seems to have worked its way into Rowling's books. Following events last year, Vice did a little digging around and noticed some troubling themes in her 2014 book, The Silkworm. Namely, how after one of the characters, Pippa, is revealed to be a trans woman following attempts to stab the protagonist, Rowling falls back on a series of lazy stereotypes such as hand size. The same thing that is still being used to this day to accuse many cis women, such as Michelle Obama, of being trans in order to try and justify abuse of them. Because reminder, that's the society Rowling and her friends have fought to create. One where abusing trans folk is normalized, therefore if you can convince someone that a person you hate is trans, your abuse of them becomes justified. However, it gets worse than that. As Strike looks over Pippa's ID, the book reads as him stating that, quote, "If you go for that door one more time, I'm calling the police and I'll testify, and I'll be glad to watch you go down for attempted murder. And it won't be fun for you, Pippa," he added. Not pre-op. End quote. For those who don't understand the subtext, this is Rowling using her protagonist to threaten a trans woman with either the risk of torturing her using her gender dysphoria, or perhaps even prison rape. That is how Rowling writes a compelling protagonist. But do you want to know the really terrifying thing? JK's book, The Silkworm, was published under her alias, Robert Galbraith, as in Robert Galbraith Heath, the world-famous psychologist who tortured a gay convict to prove it possible to turn them straight. And I know what you're thinking. No wonder Graham loves her. Because if there's one thing Graham loves, it's psychologists that torture queer people, especially those unable to give informed consent due to being underage or under legal duress. But being serious for a moment, Robert Galbraith is such a niche name, and there's no way in hell Rowling or her publisher didn't check to see who shared the name before selecting it. So the only reasonable conclusion is that she picked this name knowing its history. She either didn't care that it was a name associated with the horrific practice of torturing queer people, or she chose it specifically because of that association. And yet she pretends like she gives a rat's ass about gay people. It's the same hollow declaration as Baroness Queerphobe seen earlier. Now, not everything in the media has been a disaster. Indeed, following Rowling's rampage, a number of well-known people took to social media to voice their support for the trans community. Perhaps most notable among them was former Harry Potter actor Daniel Radcliffe, who released a statement on the Trevor Project website. The Trevor Project, for those who don't know, are a queer youth service. It was their research into the effects of conversion attempts that I cited earlier. Now, I won't read the whole thing, though I would like to read one paragraph which states that, quote, "Transgender women are women. Any statement to the contrary erases the identity and dignity of transgender people and goes against all advice given by professional healthcare associations who have far more expertise on the subject matter than either Joe or I." According to the Trevor Project, 78% of transgender and non-binary youth reported being the subject of discrimination due to their gender identity. It's clear that we need to do more to support transgender and non-binary people, not invalidate their identities, and not cause them further harm. End quote. And that really says it all. Hopefully Daniel's actions in vocally supporting the trans community as a familiar face many of us grew up knowing will help alleviate some of the pain Rowling's transphobia has inflicted. However, and this is vital, this can't be the end of the conversation. As noted, the UK has reached a point where trans people are terrified for their futures. Multi-millionaires try to silence criticism of their transphobia with threats of lawsuits, whilst members of the UK government are threatening the community as a whole with legislative violence, all operating within the doctrine of the gender-critical cult. As important as statements like those made by Daniel Radcliffe, the Trevor Project, and many more are, they're not enough in fighting this. What I want to know is why none of the big-name actors involved with the current film series haven't walked out, something that might actually cause Rowling to realise that she can't get away with continuously hurting the trans community. So perhaps reaching out to them, as well as bookstores and publishers involved, letting them know that their continued monetization in the face of Rowling's violent actions makes them complicit, would be the way to go. We also need to tackle the abusive mob behind the gender-critical cult, something the courts and various social media platforms have been an absolute failure in regards to. Because until we start to tackle the problem at its root, everything we do will be palliative at best. Transphobia does not belong in a modern society. So we need to figure out what we need to do to end this and implement it. We can't keep going in circles over this. Now, if you appreciate what myself and Adita do here on the channel in fighting back against misinformation, do know that you can support us via Patreon. Your support gives us the funds to keep going and keep putting out videos involving this level of research. You can also check out our other videos to see more of what we have to offer. So with that said, we'd just like to thank our Patreon sponsors, giving a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, Soraya and Katie, Garrett Van Vorst, Chelsea Williams, Wellington Marcus, Steve Corbin, Sosh Daniels, Justin Allen, and Atlas5. And for myself and Adita, take care now.